The farmer's name was Ivan Pavlovich Sereda, and on the morning of March 18, 1943, he stood in the mud outside his collective farm workshop near the village of Novo Ivanovka, approximately 12 kilometers southwest of Kharkov, holding a length of tractor chain that weighed perhaps 30 pounds. The chain was crude, forged from soft steel in a local factory that had been relocated east ahead of the German advance in 1942. It had broken twice already that winter. Sereda had welded it back together both times, and the welds were visible as rough, slightly thickened links that caught the morning light differently than the rest of the metal. He was not thinking about tanks. He was thinking about spring planting, which was perhaps 3 weeks away if the weather held, and about the fact that his STZ-5 tractor, a Stalinets model built in Stalingrad before the war, needed this chain to function. Without it, the tractor's track system would not engage properly, and without the tractor, the spring wheat could not be planted on schedule. Food production was not optional in 1943. The Soviet Union was feeding an army of more than 6 million men, while simultaneously supporting a civilian population that had lost access to the agricultural heartland of Ukraine. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Sereda would not be planting wheat that morning. Approximately 4 kilometers to the west, moving along the main road toward Kharkov, was a column of German armored vehicles. They were Sturmgeschütz III assault guns, part of the Wehrmacht's armored response to the Soviet recapture of Kharkov in February. The vehicles were designated Sturmgeschütz III Ausführung G, the most recent production variant, manufactured at the Alket Works in Berlin between December 1942 and February 1943. Each vehicle weighed 23.9 tons fully loaded. Each mounted a 75mm Stuke 40 litres, 48 gun capable of penetrating 89mm of armour at 500 metres range. They were not tanks in the technical sense. They had no rotating turret. The gun was fixed in a casemate superstructure, limiting traverse to 24 degrees left and right. But they were effective tank destroyers and infantry support vehicles, cheaper and faster to produce than true tanks, and the Wehrmacht was deploying them in increasing numbers as German tank production struggled to replace losses on the Eastern Front. The column consisted of 9 assault guns from Sturmgeschützabteilung 244, a battalion attached to the 167th Infantry Division. They were moving east as part of the German counteroffensive following the disaster at Stalingrad, attempting to retake territory and, more critically, to prevent Soviet forces from exploiting their recent victories. The crews were experienced. Most had fought in the Caucasus campaign. They knew their vehicles, knew the terrain, and knew that Soviet anti-tank capability in this sector was limited following the heavy fighting around Kharkov in February. What they did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that within 30 minutes of encountering Ivan Sereda's collective farm, 8 of those 9 assault guns would be immobilized, and the crews would abandon their vehicles in confusion and growing panic, uncertain what had disabled them. The weapon responsible would not appear in any German intelligence report. It would not be mentioned in Soviet after-action reports. It existed in a category that neither army had prepared for, an improvised anti-tank obstacle created not through military engineering, but through agricultural necessity and one farmer's desperate creativity. The Sturmgeschütz III represented a specific solution to a specific problem that the German Wehrmacht had confronted since the beginning of mechanized warfare. Traditional tanks were expensive, complex, and time-consuming to manufacture. A Panzer IV tank required approximately 3,500 man-hours to produce at the Kruppgrusen works in Magdeburg. The rotating turret alone consumed hundreds of hours of specialized machining and assembly. The turret ring, the ball bearings that allowed smooth rotation, The complex gun mounting that maintained accuracy while allowing elevation and traverse these components required precision manufacturing that strained German industrial capacity even before the war. In 1940, following the French campaign, German military planners examined their armor losses and production capabilities. They needed more armored vehicles capable of supporting infantry and destroying enemy armor, but they could not produce enough traditional tanks to meet demand. The solution was to eliminate the turret entirely. A fixed gun in a casemate superstructure required far less manufacturing complexity. The hull could be based on the existing Panzer III chassis, using proven components and established production lines. The result was the Sturmgeschütz, literally assault gun, a vehicle that could deliver direct fire support while being cheaper and faster to produce than a proper tank. By early 1943, the concept had proven successful beyond initial expectations. The Sturmgeschütz III had evolved from its original role as an infantry support vehicle into an effective tank destroyer. The Ausführung G variant, which entered production in December 1942, mounted the long-barreled 75mm Stück 40 gun, the same weapon used on the Panzer IV Ausf G and H. This gun could defeat the frontal armor of a Soviet T-34 at combat ranges, a capability that made the Sturmgeschütz invaluable on the Eastern Front, where T-34 seconds appeared in overwhelming numbers. The vehicle's low profile provided a significant tactical advantage. At 2.16 meters tall, it was nearly a meter shorter than a Panzer IV tank, making it harder to spot and harder to hit. The thick frontal armor, 80mm on the Ausf G superstructure, could resist most Soviet anti-tank guns at typical engagement ranges. The crew of 4 commander, gunner, loader, and driver could operate effectively in the confined space because they did not need to accommodate turret rotation mechanisms. German crews learned to exploit these advantages. Sturmgeschütz units developed tactics centered on ambush and defensive fighting. The vehicle would take up a hull-down position, exposing only the low superstructure, and wait for enemy armor to close within effective range. The limited gun traverse was a disadvantage in mobile warfare, but in defensive operations where the vehicle could be pre-positioned to cover likely approach routes, the limitation was acceptable. The trade-off between mobility and manufacturing efficiency made sense in 1943 when Germany needed every armored vehicle it could produce. Soviet forces had learned to respect the Sturmgeschütz. Red Army intelligence reports from late 1942 and early 1943 identified the vehicle as a significant threat, particularly in defensive operations. Soviet anti-tank crews were instructed to prioritize Sturmgeschütz targets when encountered. The vehicles were difficult to destroy frontally, requiring either flanking shots against the thinner side armor 30mm on the hull sides or close-range engagement with heavy anti-tank guns. But in March 1943, in the villages southwest of Kharkov, Soviet anti-tank guns were scarce. The fighting in February had been brutal. The Third Battle of Kharkov, which began in early February and continued into March, saw the Wehrmacht recapture the city after Soviet forces had taken it in a winter offensive. The back-and-forth fighting consumed men and materiel at rates that strained both armies. Soviet units in the area around Novo-Ivanovka were under strength, having been pushed back during the German counteroffensive. Heavy weapons, including anti-tank guns, had been lost or were concentrated elsewhere. The collective farm where Ivan Sereda worked was not a military installation. It was a state agricultural enterprise, one of thousands established during collectivization in the 1930s. Before the war, the farm had cultivated approximately 800 hectares of wheat, barley, and sunflowers. The workforce consisted of 62 families, approximately 240 people total, living in the village and surrounding cottages. They worked the land using a combination of manual labor and mechanized equipment, tractors, combines, and truck transport that represented the Soviet Union's attempt to modernize agricultural production. When the Germans occupied the region in October 1941, the collective farm system collapsed. The machinery that could be evacuated was sent east. What remained was either destroyed by retreating Soviet forces or appropriated by German occupation authorities. The population declined as able-bodied men were conscripted into the Red Army or fled east. Some families remained, attempting to survive under occupation by continuing to farm on a smaller scale, growing food for themselves and whatever they could deliver to German requisition authorities. Sereda had remained because he was 47 years old in 1941, too old for immediate conscription, and because he possessed mechanical skills that made him valuable. Before collectivization, he had worked as a blacksmith. He could repair agricultural equipment, forge replacement parts, and maintain the temperamental machinery that Soviet industry produced. During the occupation, these skills had kept him alive. The Germans needed food production to continue, which meant they needed someone who could keep the few remaining tractors operational. When Soviet forces retook the area in February 1943, the situation had not improved materially. The collective farm was in Soviet hands again, but it was devastated. Fields were mined. Buildings were damaged. Most of the livestock was gone. The tractor that Sereda was trying to repair on the morning of March 18th was one of only 2 functioning pieces of mechanized equipment on the entire farm. The other was a truck with a cracked engine block that Sereda had patched with a mixture of epoxy and metal filings, knowing it would fail completely within weeks. The STZ-5 tractor was a Stalinets model, manufactured at the Stalingrad tractor plant before the war. It was powered by a 4-cylinder diesel engine producing 52 horsepower at 1,000 revolutions per minute. The tractor used a track system similar to that of a tank, with drive sprockets, road wheels, and continuous metal tracks that distributed the vehicle's weight across soft or muddy ground. This made it effective for ploughing heavy soil, but it also made the tractor mechanically complex compared to wheeled farm equipment. The tracks required maintenance, links wore out, pins broke, tension needed constant adjustment. The chain Sereda was holding that morning was not part of the track system itself. It was part of the drive mechanism that connected the engine to the drive sprocket. When the chain had broken the first time, in January, Sereda had improvised a replacement using links salvaged from another piece of equipment. The steel was softer than it should have been, a consequence of wartime metallurgy where proper alloys were unavailable or reserved for military production. Soft steel wore faster and was more prone to fatigue failure, but it was what he had available. Soviet collective farms in 1943 operated under impossible conditions. They were expected to produce food while lacking equipment, fuel, spare parts, and labor. The state provided almost no support because every resource was directed toward the military. Farmers improvised constantly, cannibalizing broken equipment to keep a few pieces running, substituting materials, delaying repairs until absolute failure forced action. Sereda's work that morning was typical, attempting to repair a critical piece of equipment using inadequate materials and hoping it would last long enough to complete spring planting. He did not hear the German assault guns approaching until they were quite close. The sound of diesel engines and metal tracks on hard ground carried differently depending on terrain and wind direction. The morning was cold, temperatures just above freezing, with a light wind from the north that carried sound away from the farm rather than toward it. When Sereda finally noticed the noise, he looked up from his work and saw the column on the main road, perhaps 3 kilometers distant, moving slowly in a tactical formation with spacing between vehicles. His first thought was not about defense or resistance. His first thought was that the vehicles would use the road, pass by the farm, and continue toward wherever they were going. Soviet forces in the area were few and disorganized. There was no reason for the Germans to divert from their route to investigate a collective farm that clearly had nothing of military value. But the column did not continue past. At approximately 0840 hours, the lead Sturmgeschütz slowed and turned off the main road onto the dirt track that led toward the collective farm buildings. The other vehicles followed. Sereda watched this development with growing concern. German armoured vehicles investigating a collective farm could mean several things. None of them good. They might be searching for Soviet stragglers. They might be looking for supplies. They might simply be using the farm as a temporary position while they assessed the tactical situation. The assault guns moved slowly along the track, their engines running at low revolutions, tracks throwing mud to either side. The formation spread out as it approached, vehicles taking positions that suggested tactical caution rather than casual investigation. The lead vehicle stopped approximately 200 meters from the main farm building. Its commander, visible in the open hatch, surveyed the area through binoculars. 2 more assault guns moved to flanking positions. The remaining 6 held back, engines idling, maintaining spacing that would make them difficult to engage simultaneously if Soviet forces were present. Sereda understood military tactics well enough to recognize what he was seeing. The Germans were treating the farm as potentially hostile territory. They were establishing fields of fire, ensuring mutual support between vehicles, positioning themselves to respond to threats from multiple directions. This was standard German doctrine for operating in contested areas where partisan activity was possible. The fact that they were being this careful suggested they were uncertain about Soviet strength in the immediate area, which meant they might remain for some time while they assessed the situation. The farm's position was tactically significant in ways that Sereda understood better than the German commanders. The collective farm occupied slightly elevated ground, perhaps 5 meters higher than the surrounding fields. This was not dramatic elevation, but it was enough to provide observation over the approaches from 3 directions. To the west, the main road ran relatively straight for approximately 2 kilometers before curving south. To the north and east, open fields extended for 1 kilometer or more before reaching the next village. To the south, a small creek ran through a shallow ravine, creating a natural obstacle that channeled movement. If the Germans established a position here, they would control movement through this sector. Soviet forces attempting to move east along the main road would be observed and engaged. Reconnaissance patrols would be detected crossing the open fields. The position was not strong enough to hold against a determined attack with proper support, but it was strong enough to delay Soviet movement and inflict casualties, which was often sufficient for German defensive doctrine in March 1943 when the Wehrmacht was fighting to slow Soviet advances rather than achieve decisive victories. The German commander evidently reached the same conclusion. After approximately 10 minutes of observation, during which dismounted infantry searched the farm buildings and confirmed they were largely empty, the assault guns moved into defensive positions. 3 vehicles positioned themselves facing west along the main road, hull down behind the slight ridge created by the elevated ground. 2 more faced north, covering the open approaches. 1 faced east. The remaining 3 were held in reserve behind the farm buildings, where they could respond to threats from any direction or exploit opportunities if Soviet forces exposed themselves. The crews began immediate preparations to improve their positions. Infantry assigned to the assault gun battalion Sturmgeschütz, units typically operated with attached infantry squads for close protection, began digging communication trenches and observation posts. The vehicle commanders directed their drivers to make minor adjustments, seeking optimal hull-down positions where the vehicle's low profiles would be maximally effective. This was professional, competent work executed by experienced soldiers who understood their equipment and their tactical situation. Sereda watched this activity from inside one of the farm buildings, where he had taken shelter when the vehicles first approached. He was not alone. 7 other civilians remained on the farm, mostly older men and women who had nowhere else to go. They understood that the Germans establishing a defensive position here meant the farm would likely become a battlefield if Soviet forces attempted to advance through this sector. The smart decision would be to leave, to move east, away from the fighting. But leaving meant abandoning what little they had, and there was no guarantee that moving would improve their situation. Soviet rear areas in March 1943 were chaotic, with limited food distribution and almost no civilian services functioning. The decision was made for them approximately 90 minutes later, when Soviet artillery began ranging fire on the German position. The first shells landed 200 meters beyond the farm, throwing up columns of earth and smoke. The German crews immediately mounted their vehicles and started engines, preparing to relocate if the artillery fire became accurate. Infantry scattered to their prepared positions. The assault guns began small movements, shifting positions by 20 or 30 meters, making themselves harder to target. The Soviet artillery was not particularly accurate. The guns were firing from positions approximately 8 kilometers to the east, beyond direct observation of the target. They were likely firing based on map coordinates provided by forward observers who had reported German armored vehicles in the vicinity of the collective farm. The shells were 76mm rounds from divisional artillery, WWII III guns that were the standard Soviet field piece. At maximum range, the WWII III's accuracy degraded significantly. Wind, variations in propellant temperature, worn barrel rifling, all these factors contributed to dispersion that made precision fire difficult. But the artillery served its purpose. It forced the German assault guns to relocate, disrupting their prepared positions and revealing their presence to any Soviet units in the area. The German company commander, a Hauptmann whose name does not appear in available records, made a tactical decision. Rather than remain static under artillery fire, he ordered his unit to relocate to alternate positions approximately 1 kilometer south, near the ravine where the creek provided both cover and a natural defensive obstacle. The assault guns began moving. They did not move as a single formation but in sequence, with covering vehicles maintaining overwatch while others displaced. This was textbook German tactical movement, designed to maintain security even during relocation. The first 3 vehicles moved south along the farm track, their commanders standing in their hatches to navigate, their drivers following the uneven ground carefully to avoid throwing track or high centering on obstacles. It was the 4th vehicle, moving to follow the first 3, that encountered Sereda's tractor chain. The chain was lying across the farm track approximately 50 meters south of the main building, positioned where Sereda had been working that morning. When the Sturmgeschütz's right track rolled over the chain, the links caught in the drive sprocket and the road wheels in a way that no one, including Sereda, could have predicted. The chain itself was approximately 6 meters long, consisting of heavy links each measuring roughly 8 centimeters in length, with an internal diameter of 5 centimeters. The steel was soft, as mentioned earlier, but it was also thick. Each link was forged from stock approximately 12 millimeters in cross-section. When the assault gun's track rolled over this chain, the weight of the vehicle, 23.9 tons, pressed the chain down into the soft mud of the track. The track itself continued moving, driven by the sprocket at 17 kilometers per hour, which was the vehicle's speed during tactical movement. What happened next occurred in perhaps 2 seconds, but the mechanical sequence was complex. The chain links, pressed into the mud, did not simply flatten or break. Instead, they rotated slightly under the pressure, and several links caught simultaneously in the gaps between the assault gun's track links. The German vehicle used track links approximately 640 millimeters wide, with guide horns that engaged a center guide on the road wheels and drive sprocket. The gaps between these track links were approximately 20 to 30 millimeters, just wide enough for the tractor chain links to wedge partially into place. As the track continued moving, driven by 23 tons of vehicle weight and the torque of the Maybach HL 120 engine producing 300 horsepower, the wedged chain links acted like a mechanical jam. The track attempted to continue its rotation around the drive sprocket, but the chain prevented normal movement. For a fraction of a second, the engine's power overcame the resistance, bending several chain links. Then the mechanical forces reached a critical point. The drive sprocket, unable to move the track normally, experienced a shock load that exceeded its design parameters. The sprocket teeth, designed to engage the track links under normal operating conditions, were subjected to lateral forces they were not engineered to withstand. 3 sprocket teeth sheared off. Simultaneously, 2 of the assault gun's track links fractured under the abnormal stress. The track went slack on the right side, losing tension and dropping off several road wheels. The vehicle lurched violently to the right and stopped. The driver, feeling the sudden loss of control, immediately throttled down and applied the left brake, standard procedure when experiencing track problems. The commander, standing in his hatch, was thrown against the hatch, combing hard enough to bruise his ribs. The other crew members inside the vehicle were similarly jolted, but not seriously injured. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The damage assessment took approximately 30 seconds. The vehicle could not move under its own power. The thrown track would require at least 2 hours to repair under field conditions, assuming they had replacement track links and the tools to install them. The sheared sprocket teeth meant the vehicle needed depot-level maintenance. The drive sprocket would have to be removed and either repaired or replaced, work that could not be done in the field. The company commander ordered the crew to abandon the vehicle temporarily and continue with another assault gun. Standard German procedure was to leave disabled vehicles in place with minimal security and recover them later when the tactical situation permitted. What the German commander did not know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the tractor chain was still lying across the track. When the 5th assault gun moved forward to bypass the disabled vehicle, its driver steered slightly left to avoid the stationary Sturmgeschütz. This put his left track directly over the chain, which had shifted position slightly when the first vehicle threw its track, but remained stretched across the path. The mechanical sequence repeated. The chain caught in the left track of the 5th assault gun. The track continued moving. Links wedged into gaps. The drive sprocket experienced shock loading. This time, the result was slightly different. Instead of shearing sprocket teeth, the track itself failed catastrophically. 4 track links fractured simultaneously, and the track separated completely, whipping around the drive sprocket before falling away from the road wheels in a tangle of broken metal. The 5th assault gun stopped approximately 20 meters beyond the 4th. Its crew dismounted immediately, assessed the damage, and reported to the company commander that the vehicle was immobilized and would require extensive repair. 2 assault guns disabled within 3 minutes, both experiencing track failure in the same location, suggested either a minefield or some kind of obstacle that the initial reconnaissance had missed. The German commander ordered a halt. Infantry moved forward to investigate the track where both vehicles had been disabled. They found the tractor chain within perhaps 90 seconds of beginning their search. At first, they did not understand what they were looking at. The chain was muddy, partially buried, unremarkable in appearance. It looked like agricultural equipment, which it was. One of the infantry soldiers picked it up, examined it, and showed it to his squad leader. The squad leader, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had seen numerous examples of Soviet improvised obstacles and booby traps, made the logical assumption that this was a deliberate anti-tank obstacle. The chain had been placed across the track intentionally to disable German vehicles. The fact that it had successfully disabled 2 assault guns confirmed its effectiveness. He reported this assessment to the company commander. The commander's response was tactically sound but operationally disastrous. He ordered all remaining assault guns to halt and wait while infantry cleared the route ahead, searching for additional obstacles. This was correct doctrine when encountering potential minefields or obstacle belts. Moving armoured vehicles through uncleared obstacles invited additional losses, and the company had already lost 2 vehicles to an obstacle system they did not yet understand. But the halt order meant that 7 assault guns were now stationary on or near the farm track, spaced at intervals of 30 to 50 metres, while infantry conducted their search. The infantry moved slowly, probing the ground with bayonets, examining every depression or irregularity that might conceal an obstacle. This was careful, professional work, but it took time. During this halt, Sereda observed the situation from his position in the farm building approximately 100 meters away. He saw the 2 disabled assault guns. He saw the infantry searching the ground. He saw the chain being examined by German soldiers who were trying to determine what it was and how it had been employed. And he understood, with absolute clarity, that the Germans believed the chain was a deliberate obstacle. This understanding created a profound problem. If the Germans believed the chain was intentionally placed, they would search for whoever placed it. They would assume Soviet forces or partisans were operating in the immediate area. They would conduct reprisals against the civilian population, which meant against Sereda and the 7 other people remaining on the farm. Standard German anti-partisan doctrine in March 1943 included harsh measures against civilians in areas where partisan activity was suspected. Hostages were taken. Collective punishment was common. Summary executions occurred. Sereda made a decision that would save his life and the lives of the others on the farm. He walked out of the building with his hands raised, approaching the nearest German soldiers slowly and clearly, presenting no threat. Through a combination of poor German, hand gestures, and obvious sincerity, he explained that the chain was his, that it was tractor equipment, that it had been lying there because he had been repairing his tractor that morning when the assault guns arrived. The German soldiers did not believe him initially. The timing seemed too convenient. An agricultural chain lying precisely where it would disable German armoured vehicles suggested deliberate placement. But Sereda led them to the tractor, showed them where the chain normally fitted in the drive mechanism, demonstrated the broken links that he had been attempting to repair. He showed them his welding equipment, the crude forge he used for repairs, the other pieces of broken farm equipment scattered around the workshop area. Gradually, the German soldiers accepted his explanation. The chain was not a deliberately placed obstacle. It was agricultural equipment that happened to be lying across the track through coincidence and poor timing. The fact that it had disabled 2 assault guns was an accident, a piece of extraordinarily bad luck that no one could have predicted. But accepting that explanation did not solve the German company commander's immediate problem. 2 of his assault guns were disabled, immobilized by a piece of farm equipment that should never have been capable of damaging military vehicles. The mechanical reality was undeniable. The tractor chain, through a combination of its dimensions, material properties, and the specific geometry of the assault gun's track system, had created sufficient resistance to cause catastrophic mechanical failure in both vehicles. The commander ordered his remaining 7 assault guns to proceed with extreme caution, with infantry walking ahead to physically clear the route. This reduced the column's speed to approximately 3 kilometers per hour, the pace of a man walking carefully and examining the ground. The tactical disadvantage was significant. Armoured vehicles moving at walking speed lost most of their mobility advantage, and became vulnerable to anti-tank weapons and artillery fire. The third vehicle to cross the area where the chain had been, it had now been removed and thrown aside by German infantry, experienced no problems. Neither did the fourth or fifth, but the sixth assault gun, moving over ground that had been churned by the previous vehicles, experienced a different type of failure. The soft mud, compressed and displaced by multiple heavy vehicles, created conditions where the assault gun's tracks lost traction. The driver attempted to power through, increasing engine revolutions, which caused the tracks to dig deeper rather than find purchase. Within 90 seconds, the vehicle was stuck. Its hull settled into mud deep enough that the tracks could not reach solid ground. Recovery would require another vehicle to tow it free, but this created a new problem. The seventh assault gun, positioned to assist with recovery, approached too close and also began sinking into the destabilized ground. The driver, recognizing the danger, attempted to reverse, but the vehicle's weight had already compressed the mud beyond its load-bearing capacity. Both vehicles were now stuck, their tracks spinning ineffectively, engines roaring at high revolutions but producing no forward movement. The situation had deteriorated from 2 vehicles disabled by an obstacle to 4 vehicles immobilized, 2 by mechanical damage, 2 by terrain conditions created during the attempt to bypass the original problem. The company commander reassessed. He had 9 assault guns when he began this movement. 4 were now immobilized. Of his remaining 5 vehicles, 3 were needed to provide security for the recovery operation, and 2 could potentially be used for towing. But towing a 24-ton vehicle through soft ground required careful preparation, including laying fascines or other materials to create a stable surface. This work would take hours. During those hours, Soviet forces would have time to position artillery, move anti-tank guns into range, or organize an infantry assault against the strung-out German column. The company was tactically vulnerable, and remaining in this position invited destruction. The commander made the difficult but correct decision to abandon the recovery effort temporarily. He ordered the 4 immobilized vehicles secured, which meant removing breech blocks from the main guns, to render them inoperable, and withdrew with his 5 remaining assault guns to the alternate position he had originally intended to occupy. The withdrawal meant that 4 assault guns, representing approximately 1 million Reichsmarks of manufacturing investment and 4 months of production capacity at the Alket works, were left behind at a collective farm southwest of Kharkov because of a tractor chain and the soft ground of early spring. German recovery units would return 3 days later, by which time Soviet forces had advanced through the area. They found the 4 assault guns stripped of useful equipment by retreating German forces and partially demolished to prevent their use by Soviet troops. 1 was later recovered by Soviet forces and sent to a testing facility near Moscow, where it was examined and evaluated. The other 3 were eventually scrapped, but the immediate consequences extended beyond the loss of vehicles. The remaining 5 assault guns in the company reached their alternate position approximately 4 hours behind schedule. This delay disrupted the defensive coordination that German forces were attempting to establish in the sector. Infantry units expecting armor support found themselves without it during a critical period. Soviet reconnaissance units, encountering less resistance than expected, advanced further than German planners had anticipated, creating gaps in the defensive line that required additional units to be committed. These tactical disruptions were small in the context of the Third Battle of Kharkov, which involved hundreds of thousands of troops and hundreds of armoured vehicles on both sides. The loss of 4 assault guns from Sturmgeschütz Abteilung 244 did not change the battle's outcome. German forces successfully recaptured Kharkov in March 1943, inflicting heavy casualties on Soviet forces and stabilizing the southern sector of the Eastern Front temporarily. The Germans held Kharkov until August, when Soviet forces retook the city permanently during the summer offensive following the Battle of Kursk. But for the German soldiers who experienced the incident, the psychological impact was more significant than the tactical consequences. Experienced crews who trusted their equipment, who understood the capabilities and limitations of their vehicles, who had fought successfully in multiple campaigns, were forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Their assault guns could be disabled by agricultural equipment, not by sophisticated Soviet engineering, not by purpose-built anti-tank obstacles, not by mines or specialized weapons, by a farmer's tractor chain lying in mud. The incident report, filed by the company commander and preserved in the battalion's war diary, is matter-of-fact in its language. It describes the mechanical failures, attributes them to an obstacle of agricultural origin, notes the tactical delays, and recommends increased attention to route reconnaissance. The report does not mention embarrassment or frustration, but both emotions are implicit in the careful documentation of exactly how a simple piece of equipment caused such disproportionate effects. German military culture in 1943 placed enormous emphasis on technical superiority and mechanical reliability. The Wehrmacht's success in the early war years had been built partly on superior equipment and partly on superior employment of that equipment. German tanks, assault guns, artillery, and small arms were generally better designed and better manufactured than their Soviet equivalents. German maintenance procedures were thorough. German crews were well trained. The assumption that German equipment would perform reliably under field conditions was not arrogance, it was based on years of successful operations. The tractor chain incident challenged that assumption. It demonstrated that mechanical systems, no matter how well designed, could fail under circumstances that designers never anticipated. The Sturmgeschütz III's track system was engineered to handle combat stresses, rough terrain, high speeds, sudden direction changes, impacts from small arms fire. But it was not engineered to handle soft steel chains wedging into the gaps between track links, because no one designing the vehicle had imagined that scenario as a realistic threat. Soviet forces, when they learned of the incident through interrogation of captured German soldiers and examination of the abandoned vehicles, drew different conclusions. Soviet military intelligence was constantly searching for effective methods to disable or destroy German armor with minimal resources. Anti-tank guns were effective but required skilled crews and were vulnerable to German counter-battery fire. Mines were effective but required large numbers to create meaningful obstacle belts. Molotov cocktails and satchel charges were effective but required infantry to close to point-blank range, which resulted in heavy casualties. A method that could disable German armor using materials available on any collective farm was potentially valuable. Soviet engineers examined the concept, conducting tests with various types of chain and cable to determine if the effect could be reliably reproduced. The results were mixed. Under specific conditions, soft ground, heavy vehicles, chains of particular dimensions catching track systems at particular angles, the effect could sometimes be replicated, but it was not reliable enough to become doctrine. The variables were too numerous. Different track designs reacted differently. Hard ground did not allow chains to wedge properly. Crews who saw chains on the ground could simply avoid them. The Soviet military ultimately classified the incident as interesting but not operationally significant. They did not issue instructions for widespread use of chains as anti-tank obstacles. They did not incorporate the concept into partisan warfare manuals. The tractor chain remained what it had always been: agricultural equipment that, under a specific and largely unrepeatable set of circumstances, had happened to disable German armoured vehicles. For Ivan Pavlovich Sereda, the incident had personal consequences that extended beyond the immediate danger. After the German withdrawal, Soviet authorities questioned him extensively about what had occurred. The fact that German vehicles had been disabled at his farm, combined with his survival and the survival of the other civilians, created suspicion. Soviet security services in 1943 were deeply concerned about collaboration. Civilians who had lived under German occupation were often suspected of providing aid to the enemy, and the standards of proof required to establish innocence were minimal. Sereda's explanation that the chain was agricultural equipment accidentally left on the track was eventually accepted, partly because the German incident report, captured when Soviet forces retook the area, corroborated his version of events, but he remained under occasional surveillance for months afterward. His mechanical skills, which had made him valuable during the occupation, now made him suspect. People with specialized knowledge were dangerous in Stalin's Soviet Union, particularly if they had survived circumstances where others had not. The collective farm returned to agricultural production in late spring of 1943, though at greatly reduced capacity. Fields that had been mined required clearing. Equipment that had been damaged required repair. The labor force was depleted. Sereda repaired his STZ-5 tractor using salvaged parts from one of the abandoned German assault guns. Specifically, he fabricated a new drive chain, using links cut and reshaped from German track components, which were made of higher quality steel than Soviet agricultural equipment. The irony of using German military materials to repair Soviet farming equipment was not lost on him, but irony was a luxury that had limited value in 1943 when survival required pragmatic solutions. The tractor functioned adequately for the remainder of the war and for several years afterward. The chain Sereda, fabricated from German track links, wore better than the original Soviet chain had, lasting through multiple planting seasons. When the tractor finally wore out completely in 1948, the chain was salvaged and used on another piece of equipment. It may still exist somewhere in Ukraine, incorporated into machinery whose operators have no knowledge of its origin or its brief intersection with military history. The broader significance of the incident lies not in its tactical impact, which was minimal, but in what it revealed about the nature of mechanized warfare in 1943. The German assault guns disabled by Sereda's chain represented sophisticated military technology, complex machines engineered by skilled designers, manufactured in modern factories, operated by trained crews. They were products of an industrial system that had been developed over decades, refined through combat experience, optimized for battlefield performance. But sophisticated systems have failure modes that cannot always be predicted. Engineering is the art of managing trade-offs, and every design decision involves compromises. The Sturmgeschütz III's track system was designed to be durable, maintainable, and effective across varied terrain. But the specific geometry of the track links, necessary for those design goals, created vulnerabilities that only became apparent when the track encountered obstacles the designers had never considered. A tractor chain was not on any German engineer's list of anticipated threats in 1942 when the Ausführung G was being designed. This vulnerability was not unique to German equipment. Soviet, American, and British armoured vehicles had similar sensitivities to obstacles and terrain conditions. Tank tracks are inherently vulnerable components. They must be strong enough to carry vehicle weight across rough ground, while remaining flexible enough to conform to terrain and navigate obstacles. This combination of requirements creates mechanical complexity, and complexity creates opportunities for failure. The difference between German and Soviet responses to this reality reflected broader differences in military philosophy. German doctrine emphasized technical solutions, better engineering, better materials, better manufacturing to reduce vulnerabilities. Soviet doctrine emphasized numerical superiority and acceptable loss rates. If German assault guns could be disabled by tractor chains, The solution from a German perspective was to improve route reconnaissance and recovery procedures. The solution from a Soviet perspective was to produce enough tanks and assault guns that losing some to unpredictable failures did not materially affect operational outcomes. By March 1943, Soviet industrial production was beginning to demonstrate the effectiveness of that philosophy. Tank production at factories in the Urals, evacuated from Western Russia ahead of the German advance, was reaching levels that German planners found difficult to believe. The Tankograd complex in Chelyabinsk was producing approximately 202 T-34 tanks per month. The Uralmash factory in Sverdlovsk was producing self-propelled guns at similar rates. Soviet production in 1943 would total approximately 24,000 armoured vehicles of all types, tanks, self-propelled guns, and armoured cars. German production in the same period would total approximately 10,700 armoured vehicles, including assault guns like the Sturmgeschütz III. The numerical disparity was growing, not shrinking, despite German efforts to increase production. Every assault gun disabled by mechanical failure, terrain conditions, or improvised obstacles represented a loss that German industry struggled to replace. Every Soviet vehicle lost was replaced within weeks by new production. The incident at Novo-Ivanovka in March 1943 was a microcosm of this larger reality. 4 German assault guns were lost to causes that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness or crew skill. They were lost to mechanical vulnerability and circumstance. Those 4 vehicles represented resources Germany could not afford to lose: manufacturing capacity, trained crews, tactical capability. But more fundamentally, they represented the limits of technical sophistication when confronted with the unpredictable complexity of warfare. Ivan Sereda did not think in these terms. His understanding of the incident was simpler and more immediate. His tractor chain, left on the ground because he had been interrupted while making repairs, had disabled German armoured vehicles through accident. The Germans had interpreted it as a deliberate obstacle. Soviet authorities had suspected him of collaboration. The actual truth, that it was simply agricultural equipment in the wrong place at the wrong time, was less interesting to both sides than the narratives they preferred. He survived the war, continued working as a mechanic and blacksmith on the collective farm, and died in 1961 at age 67 from complications of pneumonia. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his mechanical skills and his service to the collective farm. It did not mention the incident with the assault guns, which had never been officially recognized or commemorated. The story survived primarily through oral tradition, passed among veterans and local residents who remembered the war years, gradually acquiring embellishments and inaccuracies as such stories do. The 4 abandoned assault guns were eventually documented by Soviet recovery teams and listed in records as captured equipment. 1, as mentioned, was sent for technical evaluation. The others were scrapped for steel, which was desperately needed for reconstruction. The soldiers who had crewed those vehicles survived the war in various circumstances. Some were killed in subsequent fighting, some were captured, some returned to Germany in 1945 to find their cities destroyed and their families scattered. None of them ever learned that the obstacle which had disabled their vehicles was a tractor chain, accidentally left behind by a farmer making repairs. The incident report they filed described agricultural obstacles of indeterminate origin, and that description, vague and bureaucratic, was how the event entered the historical record. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more revealing than the official language suggested. Modern warfare, for all its technical sophistication and careful planning, remained vulnerable to the banal unpredictability of circumstance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.